So as I said before, we are having a reception after this on the other side of the museum, so we can go straight to the reception after this. Also, I got some extra time from the museum, so we will have plenty of time for questions. Questions for Walter, not for Omar. I have to say it's a pleasure to me to present the presenter. He's a Chilean poet, very well known among poets. Also, some of his work has been translated into Italian, and he's a wonderful friend. So, Jesus Sepulveda will introduce Walter Mignolo.
Thank you for that presentation, Alejandro. This is going to be a presentation with the barret. And Walter and I already agreed that we are going to give this presentation with the barret. So this is going to be a barret presentation. The first time I read Walter Mignolo was back in late 80s when I was an undergraduate student at the Metropolitan University in Santiago, Chile. Walter somehow has been part of the intellectual world of my generation. Then we were reading his Teoría del Texto e Interpretación de Textos, a book of literary theory and semiotics that influenced a whole generation of students of language and literature of the time. Later, I met him physically here in Eugene when he came to give a talk at the University of Oregon about his work on border thinking in the context of post-coloniality and cultural imperialism. In this work, Mignolo introduces the crucial notion of colonial difference to understand the modern colonial world, tracing the emergence of new forms of knowledge, which is what he calls border thinking. This notion points out the limits of Western knowledge from the perspective of a different epistemology in the periphery of the empire. Last time Walter and I saw each other was in Arcata, California. And I remember very well the refreshing dialogue at the time about the civilizing process dominated by the West and its implications, the globalization and standardization of the world which we currently inhabit. That time we also talked about the necessity of leaving behind the nation-building mentality in order to embrace the communal sense of indigenous peoples, excluded from the map of critical thinking by the image of a uniform and homogeneous Latin America. Then our dialogue was interrupted, except for a couple of emails. But today I have the honor to introduce him as one of the main Latin American intellectuals and philosophers of our times, whose influence has been crucial for many generations of Latin American as well as American students and thinkers. Walter Mignolo is a professor of literature at Duke University and has joint appointments in cultural anthropology and Roman studies. He has taught at the University of Toulouse, Indiana, and Michigan. He's also a director of the Center for Global Studies and the Humanities, and he's the academic director of the program Duke in the Andes, placed in Quito, Ecuador. Professor Mignolo has published extensively on semiotics and literary theory, as well as on issues such as global coloniality, the geopolitics of knowledge, transmodernity, border thinking, and the pluriversalities. His work has been published in English as well as in Spanish, French, and Portuguese. Professor Mignolo is the author of Teoría del Texto e Interpretación de Textos, back in 1986. I'm right. Local Histories, Global Designs, year 2000. The Darker Side of the Renaissance, 2003, which won the Catherine Singer Kovacs Prize from the Modern Language Association. The Idea of Latin America, 2006, and The Darker Side of Western Modernity, published this year. He's also the editor of Capitalismo y Geopolítica del Conocimiento, el Eurocentrismo y la Filosofía de la Liberación en el Debate Intelectual Contemporáneo, as well as the Americas, Loci of Enunciations and Imaginary Constructions. Today, Professor Mignolo will talk about ethics and decoloniality with the barret. And it is my pleasure to introduce him. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. And thank you very much for thank you very much for being here. I know that this is a sad afternoon. It's raining. Oregon is losing 41-3 to Stanford. So what else can you do? Just it's a good place to be in the museum, right? So my talk is indeed very easy because everything I want to say has been said. So I will just comment. And will be very difficult because it will be very difficult to say something original or new in the kind of the richness of the papers that have been read and discussed so far. But I'll do my best to, I know it's late, you are also tired, so I try to do it short and sweet so you kind of don't fall asleep. Well, I have 4 points. One is, of course, America. The second is, guess, ethics. The third is decoloniality. The fourth is decoloniality, the politicization of the civil society and the emerging political society. And so I will try to connect the question of ethics to this point. And then you have a conclusion that I will try to kind of, it's a conclusion that's opening up because I will say something about ethics and aesthetics that has already been put on the table. But that will be the conclusion and an opening. So I will follow also the teaching of my teachers, Enrique and Nelson. And I will start using, which one do you use? This one? So, America first. (1500). Imagine the world in 1500. America was in nobody's mind. Really, nobody knew, nobody thought, nobody imagined something, some entity that will be soon, 4 years after, called America. What existed was Tahuantinsuyo, was Anahuac, was Abya-Yala, was Ayiti, and a lot of cultures that kind of were disappeared, lost, etc., etc. So in 1500 was no America, and also there was a lot of different civilizations in the world of different ages. So China was there for thousands of years. India, the Persian Shahate Persia was not an empire. The only empire was the Roman. The gone or the decay Islamic Caliphate that started in the 6th century. The emerging at that time 3 sultanates that were emerging of the decay of the Caliphate. The Mughal, the Safavid, and the Ottoman. Keep it in mind, because when French and English began to expand and take over the leading of the world from Spain and Portugal, where do they go? To the Mughal, to the Safavid, and to the Ottoman, to Iran and Iraq, and then we have 2011, right? And were the Anahuac, and were the Mayas, and were the Incas, and were the Kingdom of Africa, and there was no Western civilization. It was just a bunch of Western Christians who lost the center in the crusade, and they were marginal in the West. Of course, there were 3 very important Italian cities 1,000 years after the collapse of the Roman Empire: Genova, Venice, and Florence, that were kind of having a prosperous commerce. But they had the back to the West. They were looking south to Tangier, to Fez, and they were looking east. There was a Greek civilization, but the Greeks were not looking west. The Greeks were looking south, and they were looking east, because there were the Persians were there and the Egyptians were there. Nothing there, right? So that was the situation in 1500, more or less. And all of a sudden, this place that was not the place of the Western Christian began to emerge as a powerhouse and began to kind of be erected, constructed as Western civilization, as what we know today as Europe, right? So what is interesting is when that happened, and obviously the Indias Occidentales has a lot to do. So when that happened is because at the beginning of the modern colonial world, at the beginning of the issues that we are discussing today, at the beginning was the Pope. That Pope was Alexander VI. What did the Pope do? You see, I'm imitating Enrique. The Pope, in 1594, because of the Treaty of Tordesillas, he divided the Atlantic in Indias Occidentales and Indias Orientales. And in 1529, with the treaties of Zaragoza, he divided the Indias Orientales. And he gave the donation of the Pope to Spain and Portugal. There you have globalization. There you have the foundation of globalization. There you have the foundation of what Schmidt called global linear thinking. Behind the Schmidt is the Pope. Appropriation of the earth and the justification through international law and global linear thinking of the expropriation that we have been talking about during these 2 days. What is really fascinating here is that whatever, let's say that this is Greece. Greece began to be highlighted by these people in 1500 Europe, and they began to trace the line, right? Greece, Rome, Castile, because Castile was the center. So what they did, they crossed out Constantinople, where really kind of Christianity joined the Roman Empire, because Christianity didn't join the Roman Empire in Rome, they joined it in Constantinople. And so that line began to be the line that, of the Orthodox. So, and all of a sudden, this civilization that began to emerge as Western civilization had a symbolic, famous TO map, Asia, Europe, and Africa. And it's this map that you see and you don't see in any world map that you see today in the television, for example, in the world, in any kind of world map. Because when America emerged as a fourth part of the world. For whom? For this cosmovision, not for the others, right? So, in that sense, what Nelson said and Eduardo repeated, we have here a very, the historical condition for a very important concept that in my presentation, but also that has been around these last 2 days. If indeed the invention of America is a theological suspension of the ethical, this is already a decolonial concept. Because for the Spanish, there is not such a suspension. For the Spanish, it's a justification of progress and civilization and conversion. So what, from the decolonial point of view, is a theological suspension of the ethical. From the Spanish point of view, is the detour. The detour, what I mean, that this line that goes from Greece to Rome to Europe takes a detour through the Atlantic. In such a way that when Kant gets Aristotle, he doesn't get it directly from Greece. He gets it from the detour, but he doesn't mention it, right? And through the detour, what happened? That the Greek concept of cosmos has been translated into orbis Christianus terrarum. So that is what kind of America emerged in the consciousness of a community. That becomes Europe and began to build Western civilization, because Greece and Rome are not Western civilization until the Renaissance. They began to tell the story of the Western civilization and invent itself as Western civilization. So that is my first point. So the question is, in the first point, is so it says there the three concepts. There are not three concepts. It's one concept in three. It's like the Trinity. and this is a very important principle of the project Modernity Coloniality, that these three entities are one concept. And how does it work? And how is relevant what I am saying? Modernity is not a historical period. The same way I say that Latin America is a project, modernity is a project. It's a project of the Christian European. And then the secular that will take over that project. But that will be a family feud, right? This is kind of all stay in house. So the rhetoric of modernity is a rhetoric of salvation. So that is why the suspension of the ethical is a decolonial analysis. From the rhetoric of modernity, coloniality is hidden. You don't want people to see coloniality. You want to see people, the rhetoric of modernity, what the paradise, happiness, the market democracy, crisis will come back, people will have jobs, don't worry, we are fit. So the rhetoric of modernity has been always a rhetoric of salvation and happiness and promises. And hiding the logic of coloniality, that somebody say, well, it's the logic that kills. Of course, that's it. The logic of coloniality is the logic that kills, but of course, you cannot say that. You have to kind of hide coloniality into a kind of the rhetoric of salvation, which is a rhetoric, which is an ethic of the project of modernity. And what decoloniality is doing is unveiling what the rhetoric of modernity is hiding. So in such a way that in the 16th century you have those three entities in one concept. You have the rhetoric of modernity, there's the rhetoric of salvation. You have the logic of coloniality, that's a kind of genocide, African slavery. And you have decoloniality, which is, I will talk a little bit later on, which is decoloniality that immediately the reaction, the responses to coloniality from the point of view, from the perspective of the indigenous people, but also of the black, of the African. And also you have the critical within, like Las Casas. I want to, but keep these three trajectories of the decolonial responses. No? So the second point I want to make about the Americas, that is important, I think, for our project here, Americas, Etica and the Americas, is the demographic configuration of the Americas. It has to do with movement of people who were here. It has to do with memories, identities, and everything that we are discussing today. So for 3 centuries, almost 4 centuries, I would say, 3 centuries and half, from 1500 to 1800, there are 3 basic demographic groups that populate that new entity called America. The people who were here, from the Mapuches to the Four Nations, to the Nahua, the Incas, the Haiti, the Abya Yala, etc. The migrants without passport, the European, and who came without being invited either, right? All those groups are diverse. There is a tremendous diversity of indigenous people. There is a tremendous diversity of European. They are Spanish, they are Portuguese, they are French, they are Dutch, etc., etc. And the third group, which is the enslaved Africans. So these are the 3 demographic. Then they come here and began to mix. And you don't know who has what kind of blood. But the memories, the 3 trajectories of memories remain there. I relate to African slavery and indigenous genocide in a different way. I mean, I'm kind of European descent. I am not even, because European descent, among the diversity of European descent, you have the Creole, you have the mestizos, and you have what we call immigrant. So the people who arrived in the second half of 19th century on, right? Like Dussel and myself, I mean, the family. So, so these 3 basic groups and memories constitute the Americas. There are, of course, after the 19th century, there are more migrations, and for 2 reasons. One is because the end of slavery kind of give freedom to the black, but they need kind of people from India. So there is still today we have the Indian people in the Caribbean. And also because in 1850, the steamboat and the railroad, the Industrial Revolution, allows people to begin to move massively around the globe. But until 1850, it was much more difficult to. So these are what I see as the basic demographic foundation of the Americas, and we have been talking here about what? About Christianity, about Afro-American, and about indigenous people. It's not that there are not other people in the Americas, but are these people who have political project? And that we kind of we're talking about the people who, we are not anthropologists who are kind of describing the population, but we are kind of thinkers that are trying to think how people think and what people do and how people react under a specific condition. Well, so that is basically what I have to say about the Americas. No? Now let's move to the second point. The second point is ethics. You see, when you look at this, so I just, when I start kind of preparing this talk, I just Google. So what is there? What people are saying now on ethics? Who is kind of, what have they put in there? And then I went to the history of ethics. And of course, I mean, I more or less know, but I want to confirm the history of ethics is Aristotle and then Kant, etc. It's like the rest of the world doesn't have ethics, never, until the Greek. So I began to talk about ethics in quotation mark, which is Western ethics, and ethics without quotation mark. That is what we know, what, because of, I mean, for many sources, but I mean, Sagún has a chapter on his history of New Spain of Retórica y Filosofía Moral, and he was really admire the way that the kind of the rule, the behavior that the Aztecs have in the organization of the society. We know, and we know now more than before, that Confucius was not Confucius, Confuzi. We don't know if really a guy named Confucius existed, or that was an invention of the Christian. But what we do know is that Confuzi were a set of rules to the kind of the organization, the ethical organization, the character, the moral, etc., etc. So the first point is that ethics, in quotation mark, is still the hegemonic way of thinking about ethics. And I want to start trying to decolonize that. Decolonize means to undo. To undo what the rhetoric of modernity have done. So one way, with the first step, will be to say, well, ethics is the way, number one, is the way that the Greek name a way of behavior and establishing some kind of ethical character, moral order in the society, that every other society that we know has done it. But because Greece became the foundation of Western civilization, and Western civilization became global, then the Greek concept of ethics acquired a universal value. So that is the first point. The second point of undo is just related to the detour. When ethics took the detour on the Atlantic, it happened, what already I said, it happened. We know Las Casas was a tremendous, drastic critic of the greediness of the conquistadores and the encomenderos and all that. But he never put in question that the indigenous people had to be converted. He said that he had to be converted by peaceful means. But peaceful means of conversion are really violent. So that is the kind of the first kind of, the detour is the second way of kind of start kind of undoing the universality of ethics. And at the same time that Las Casas, another good Christian, engaged in that kind of peaceful way of violence, they also contributed to silence the decolonial move that was beginning to emerge in the Andes and in the Caribbean. So one of the first ethico-political treaties that emerged in the Andes is Guamán Poma de Ayala. Guamán Poma de Ayala sided with Las Casas, and I say, yes, Bartolomé, you are right. These people are delinquent. They are not Christians. But then he also say, why you want to convert me? I am Christian. And so he writes the history, the new chronicle and new government, to kind of match the history of the Andean people with the history of Christianity. Now, this is very important for our conversation and the conversation we're having this month, because when Eduardo, I think, rightly pointed out that what Enrique is doing in the theology of liberation is to pick those elements of Christianity that can be re-articulated not for regulation or oppression, but for liberation. That is correct, but at the same time, that is what the Guamán Poma de Ayala was doing. But here we have a very important moment that your talk was addressing, and that was the limit of Mariátegui. Mariátegui, like Las Casas, was not yet able to give up Las Casas as Christian and Mariátegui as Marxist, that they have to decide about this kind of social order. They were not yet willing and able to recognize that this new order has to be done together with people who may be using also Christianity or Marxism, but that they belong to a different cosmology. So the question may not be so much for us to recover that sensibility, as you call, or cosmology, because there is nothing to recover. It was always there, still there, and we know more and more that indigenous people or black people are reenacting it themselves. So that is the second moment of the kind of the decolonization of ethics. And the third moment is Autoba Cubano. Autoba Cubano was a slave, 18th century. He's got this book I have written about. Thought and sentiment on the evil of slavery. 1786. So if you remember, Adam Smith, Autoba published this, wrote, because he was a slave in Jamaica, and Campbell took him with him to London. And we know this many stories of slaves that the owner, the master, kind of teach read and write. So that happened with Autoba Cubano. So in London, he writes this book. 10 years after Adam Smith wrote Thought and Sentiments, a theory of sentiment. So Cubano writes a thought and sentiment. And he does two things that are important for us. He also is Christian. He does not need to be converted. He kind of adopt Christianity, but through Christianity, he begins to criticize the Christians. So when an Indian or a black criticizes Christianity, it's very different from the ethical position of people from European or European descent that does the same kind of operation, right? And I want to link that to Native American today. I mentioned yesterday George Thinker. I think George Thinker is kind of engaged in that kind of the same kind of tradition, and he's very drastic and radical because on the one hand, he criticized Christianity, the institution. He appropriates Jesus, that you were mentioning today, but he doesn't let go the kind of Native American cosmology. So this is very interesting how they kind of take, and one of the books of George Thinker is called Spirit and Resistance, a Native American Theology of Liberation. Political theology. A Native American political theology of liberation. I don't want to enter here to elaborate with Schmidt, but this is a very... Now, let me... the second point, and I will get back to Thinker, the second point of Autoba Cubano is, one is, well, I am Christian, and what these people are doing, Spanish and Dutch, and maybe for a black there is no distinction between Spanish and Portuguese and Dutch, is totally unacceptable. And so he kind of arrived to elaborate a principle of sovereignty that is very different from the principle of sovereignty that we find in the political theory in Europe. For Cubano, it's not a question of state, it's that no human being has the right to exploit, own, and sell another human being. So they kind of move the flag from the question of the state and the international relation to the level of human relation. And from there you can begin to build a different kind of world. Now, Thinker, I want to just point three aspects that are relevant to make my point. One I find very, he has a good sense of humor. He begins this book on Spirit and Resistance. In 1804, France bought a tremendous amount of Osage land. No, United States bought a tremendous amount of Osage land from France. So Osages to this day are trying to figure that one out. How is that happening? So in that kind of argument on the question of the land that we're talking, I think this is very important. I will push later on this issue. When he said, when we talk about spirituality, our New Age white friends, they love us because they like spirituality. They have a way to kind of deal with their guilt. But when we say, for us, spirituality is related to land. So they become serious because they think that what we are going to do is to kind of take the land back and say, and they are right. And what he emphasized this, and this is very important, is kind of uncouple land with property. So land has not anything to do with property, but we know that at the very beginning of the discovery and conquest of America, land became a property. And became a property even at the moment in which still we didn't have a political economy, because the political economy, we don't have political economy proper until Smith. But political economy was part of political theology and international law. What the Vittoria does is precisely to kind of invent a logic in which, on the one hand, he states that Indian and Spaniard are equal. They are endowed of ius gentium. But then what do you do? I mean, they are equal. Well, they are endowed of ius gentium, but they are not quite rational. They are like women or like child. And because they are women or child, so you kind of invent a law that justify the expropriation or give the right to the Spanish to enter. So you have, again, the modernity, coloniality. So Guamán Poma de Ayala, to just kind of play a little bit more about this kind of decoloniality of Western ethics. On the one hand, he tells the story of Christianity. So you don't need to convert me because I'm a Christian. But what is more interesting is that New Chronicle is a way of telling Philip III how to organize a new government. He tells the story because he tells Philip III, well, Felipe, Guamampama, he considered himself a prince. So he was talking to Philip, it's kind of the same kind of band. And he said, Philip, if you want to, because it was a mess. I mean, we are talking about the Reinato del Peru in the last centuries of the 16th century, and over there was a mess. I mean, the Takiunkoi, the kind of the movement of the equivalent of the terrorists today, except that at that moment, instead of bomb, they just kind of dance, and they convoke the Huacas, because the Huacas in the bodies will kind of help to expel the Spaniard. So that was a mess. And so Guamán Poma de Ayala said, if you want to organize this place peacefully, number one, you cannot listen to your historian. They're just kind of lying. So he tells the story in order to propose a new government. And what does he propose? And that has to do with Maria Etica again. I mean, Maria Etica couldn't see that. I mean, we will discuss why he couldn't see it. But what Guamán Poma de Ayala proposed is the reorganization of Tahuantinsuyo, not an organization that will be based on the political theory of the moment. That was basically Machiavelli and the kind of the theological organization. He proposed a reorganization of the Tahuantinsuyo. What was the Tahuantinsuyo? The Tahuantinsuyo was the world divided in four. Tawan in Suyo. Each Suyo organized. Tawan in Suyo means that the four parts are one part. So the four parts of Tahuantinsuyo with Cusco in the center, like Jerusalem, right? Like Tenochtitlan, like Beijing. I mean, we were in that moment in which different civilizations were themselves the center. So he said, okay, you reorganize the Tahuantinsuyo, you give one, because each suyo, el Tahuantinsuyo is a kind of social organization of the Inca that is very complex, but basically, so you give one suyo to the Spaniard, one suyo to the Indian, one suyo to the black, and one suyo to the Muslim. And you center, and you go sit at the center in Cusco. That was a kind of, you can discuss it today, and etc., but that was a kind of revolutionary, because it's a displacement of the ethico-political conceptualization of the Spaniard, and the way that the Spaniards were kind of using ethics and politics to control, to repress, to suppress. Well, now, the third point is decoloniality, but I already said something. I want to just summarize what I said in relation to the question of the demographic I mentioned at the beginning. What I'm going to say is very schematic, but it's just not elaborate more, but what I would just want to give you the kind of the trajectories of decolonial projects and movement at this moment. You remember that I mentioned that the three basic demographic group that form the Americas. So what you find from the 16th century to the 21st century is a constant movement and project of we call the pueblos originarios, or the Native American, the Fourth Nation of Canada, etc. So what happened today in the United States, and you were talking, what happened today in the Andes is not what happened today, what had been happening in Chiapas. It's not something that just appeared at the end of the 20th century. There was always a continuity, but it was always kind of hidden by the rhetoric of modernity. And you mentioned a lot of argument. I mean, what the kind of argument that the civilizing mission needs to kind of suppress, invisibilize, et cetera, et cetera. But and the question is now that we don't have to recover that because the indigenous people are doing the job. The second trajectory, well, Cubano, but from Cubano to Fanon. But from Cubano to Fanon to Bob Marley, which means the Rastafarian, which means the voodoo, which means the candomblé, which means the Santeria. And those are religions, man. There are religions that are not African religions. There are religions that are, religion, quotation mark. There are religions that are political religions because these are religions of survival. It's not religion of conversion. It's not religion of to adore God. It's a religion that, I mean, we call it religion, that the kind of process, like the capoeira. It's a kind of process activities that have a dimension, a spiritual dimension. Well, it has a spiritual dimension because human beings don't live just buying all the time in kind of the shopping center. So the question of ethics at that moment is the way, I mean, the candomblé and all the kind of religion, is the way that people recover the dignity that has been taken away by this fantastic project, ethical project of Christianity, an economical project of plantation and slavery, etc., etc. And then we have us, the white. We have the right to exist. So there is a continuity, the critical continuity since the colonial period, and Enrique is mentioning Las Casas all the time, and I think that this is the kind of, for us, the people of European descent, the grounding is not the Middle Passage, the grounding is not the kind of expropriation of land and the genocide that the indigenous people suffered. The grounding is that kind of, that we align with the people of European descent that began to understand the kind of the injustice, the brutalities of the rhetoric of modernity, hiding the logic of coloniality. Right? And I think we have a fourth trajectory that is important in this history, which is the kind of Latinos, Latinas in the United States. So when I talk about the Afro, I'm not just emphasizing the Caribbean, but I'm just kind of, we know that continuity existed in the Andes, that continuity existed in Brazil, and Brazil is also Caribbean. And if I can make a kind of footnote here about the Caribbean that Nelson was invoking today. Well, two things. One is the Caribbean is insular and is continental, right? So Bahia is as Caribbean as Charlestown in South Carolina, as New Orleans and Cuernavaca. So that's kind of and Cartagena de Indias. No? But that's kind of remember. But the thing, Nelson said, what is the idea of the Caribbean? And that make me think that the idea of Latin America exists because it was an imperial project. And the idea of the Caribbean was never an imperial project. The Caribbean was a mess where all the European imperial projects have been fighting against each other since the late 16th century. So it's very interesting to kind of rethink why the Caribbean. But in any event, I mean, there is a kind of The Afro, of course, the indigenous were colonized, but the Afro were not colonized. The Afro were kind of brought here, but it's a different process of the kind of colonization and expropriation of the indigenous people. But, I mean, we have the distribution of the Afro population in the Americas, since we were talking about Etica in the Americas, and it's very interesting because the configuration, the demographic configuration of the Afro depends very much on what kind of imperial domination they were under and what kind of national configuration they were under. And you can see now that there is a significant difference between Afro-US American and Afro-Caribbean American, or Afro-Brazilian, or Afro-Colombian, etc. So then, the question is that I see in the formation of the Americas this kind of 4 trajectories of ethico-political decolonization, which I repeat, the kind of the indigenous tradition, the Afro tradition, the European, that we have been hegemonic, but I am glad to say that this hegemony of us is ending because it's a lot of responsibility. And I feel much better working with that, trying to kind of get to that kind of social order, and the Latinos, Latinas. Well, and I have now moved to the 4th point. The decoloniality and the politicization of the civil society, and the emergence of the political society. So I have been talking about the Americas, and now I go global. I go global from the Americas. That is, you said an ethic of and from the Americas. So that's very important because of the kind of the geopolitics of thinking and doing which is at the stake. I mean, we cannot expect that the global project will always come from the local imperial places, which is European Union and United States, or where, because now it's kind of doubt how much the European... I was joking the other day in relation to this. You see, the Western civilization was found on the pedestal of Greece and Rome. And now those pedestals are both gone. Berlusconi just resigned, and Papandreou resigned about 2 weeks ago. So the foundation of Western civilization are disappearing. So, okay, what do I mean here? Let me just change terrain for a second, but I need to get the text here. Have you thought about business ethic? I think we have to... no, I mean, I think everything I said is a preparation for that. Peru Indígena, the last issue of Peru Indígena, has an article about the indignados and indignadas against neoliberalism. I will get to that, but this is serious. I have been in conversation and even in a conference with the organization, and Enrique published an article with Colado, the kind of critical management people. So the critical management people are people of manager of consciousness. They are a kind of minority within the global international organization of management, which is kind of business, and it's a huge, huge organization. But I was there, I was in San Antonio, invited by the dissenter. But it's very interesting because they kind of introduced the question of ethics in business. Duke has a center of ethics and education. And believe me, I am not invited to that. So the ethics and education is the ethics of the corporation. But what I began to notice, and I began to notice before, but it so happened that in October, I was in 2 weeks in 2 different forums. What do you call it? The World Political Forum in Rhodes, and the Biarritz Forum in Santo Domingo. The Biarritz Forum is kind of a French-controlled forum that behind, of course, is the rhetoric of modernity, helping Latin America to develop, right? But at the same time, create conditions for the participation of, in the last forum, there were about 12 ex-presidents present, a lot of journalists, scholars. Same thing in Rhodes. In Rhodes, Rhodes is controlled by the Russian. It's very interesting. So apparently, the rumor is that the collapse of Russia kind of also collapsed the intellectual tradition of Russia. So the Rhodes Forum, indirectly, is a way to begin to build the intellectual presence of Russia in the world. It's incredible. I mean, you see all the participants of the Orthodox Church, they're all there, talking, organizing panels, chairing panels, etc. But there are people basically from that part of the world, a few from Europe and United States. So Europe and United States are very kind of remote presence. But World Political Forum. What I noticed there in those 2 weeks is the consensus with that people in those forums, that the consensus, the Washington consensus was a failure and the neoliberal doctrine was a failure. From the Rhodes forums, a manifesto was written and approved to make a kind of ethical, because the Rhodes Forum is an ethical intervention on the situation of Syria and Palestine. And from the Biarritz Forum, another declaration, another manifesto proposed, or statement proposed by the president, Fernandez, of Santo Domingo, that was going to be elevated to the next meeting of the G20. And the statement was that neither food nor oil can be subjected to the commodity, to the market, the commodity of the market. So there's kind of ethical moves. And this is an ethical move, they are not Marxists, right? They're ethical move of the civil society. So the civil society is politicizing itself because of the exaggeration, the extreme, the kind of the neoliberal. So everybody felt that the situation of the crisis, of the financial crisis, but also before that, the Enron and all this kind, there is the limit of capitalism is a kind of ethical limit. So the political society trying to intervene ethically into that. And that, I think, is very, very interesting in relation to what we can call, we have the Davos Economic Forum, which we know. Then we have the Political Forum, and we have the World Social Forum. And the World Social Forum is the kind of this forum of the political society, not the politicization of the civil society, but the forum that kind of articulate something that didn't exist before, which is not just the civil society, but what is the difference between the civil society and the political society? The civil society is not questioning the system. They were not trying to improve it. And one of the ways they're trying to improve it is through ethics. But the political society is questioning the system. So that, I think, is very important to consider the question of business ethics, the corporate ethics, because now that all the universities are going corporate, they are introducing ethics as a kind of, well, it's a demand, but at the same time, it's a way of, well, you know, trying to, that things change to remain the same. Now, in that context, I think we have to think seriously, as we are actors within the higher education, about two concepts, excellence and efficiency. And excellence and efficiency, you find it, and you ask, what for? What are excellence and efficiency hiding? And I think that this is a question that we have to attack from the kind of ethical perspective. So to give you a little bit more, because all of this emerged, number one, there is a trajectory, of course, there was a trajectory in the university, the corporativization university, in which efficiency, excellence, and ethics appear. But the major kind of politicization of the civil society is because of the financial crisis. So I will read a couple of things, just a couple of paragraphs that will give you a better sense of what is at the stake here. You know what the kind of business ethic is, but what is the philosophy behind it? The economist Milton Friedman articulates a view in an essay that is quite popular with business students. Quote, Friedman, "The social responsibility of business is to increase its profit." We know that, but it's better to remember the exact formula, right? According to Friedman, corporate officers have no obligation to support such social causes as hiring the hardcore unemployed to reduce poverty or reducing pollution beyond that mandate by law of making profit. We are ruled by the world. I mean, we can discuss a lot of things, but this is the kind of ethics that is. So their sole task of the business is to maximize profit for the company, subject to the limits of law. You don't care about the consequences as far as you are playing within the law. Right? So then you have a good rhetoric of modernity. You can play within the law, but then what the consequences of that are kind of the mobilization of people and the kind of the growing of the political society. So their sole task is to maximize profit for the company, subject to the limit of the rule and the rule of the game, that ensure open and free competition without deception or fraud. So those are the formulas that I think we have to pay attention on top of everything. So ethics not only should be studied, and this is the kind of come from the critical consciousness of manager and business. So ethics not only should be studied alongside management, but the two fields, ethics and management, are closely related. Business management is all about making the right decisions. Ethics is all about making the right decisions. So what is the difference between the two? Right? Management is concerned with how decisions affect the company, while ethics is concerned about how decisions affect everything. Right? Management operates in the specialized context of the firm, while ethics operates in the general context of the world. Management is therefore a part of ethics. A business manager cannot make the right decision without understanding management in particular, as well as ethics in general. Business ethics is management carried out into the real world. This is why business manager should study ethics. Do you think they will hire us? So this is my fourth point. I mean, on the one hand, we have the rearticulation of ethics within the corporation. We have the politicization of the civil society. And we have the emergence of global political society. At the larger scale, I will risk the following. The ethics of management is part of a politics of what I will call re-Westernization. Re-Westernization, why? Because this is the task of Obama in international relations after the disaster of Bush and Cheney administration, when the United States lost it. So, in regaining the leadership of United States, I'm not saying that they are successful, but that is the project. So the business ethics and the ethics of the corporation is just to have a good behavior while making money. So it's a new articulation of the rhetoric of modernity at the moment in which, in the 19th century, we have that the economy was part of society. But at the end of the 20th century, we have that society is part of the economy and the market. So they want to keep that, and so they have to introduce ethics, because the lack of ethics is what kind of produced the politicization of the civil society. And I will call the politicization of the civil society de-Westernization. Because the political society is not question capitalism, but it's question the West. And that was absolutely clear in the Rhodes Forum, and that was absolutely clear in the Biarritz Forum, not by the part of the French, but all the Latin America. All the Latin American participants were kind of... So I would say Lula is not leftist. Lula is a great example of de-Westernization. And the BRIC countries are a good example of de-Westernization. And de-Westernization is, for me, in this view, kind of related to the politicization of the civil society. And then we have what I will call decolonization at large. And in decolonization at large is the political society. It's not that all the kind of the political society will articulate their project in the way we articulate in it, but in the most, what we call social movement, etc., in their rhetoric, in their kind of discourse, there is always a kind of reference to, they talk about colonization, not everybody talk about coloniality, and I think for those of you who were not here, I think Nelson mentioned that colonization referred to a specific historical moment within the 500 years, like Spanish colonization or British colonization. But coloniality is the logic that kind of have all this kind of coloniality or colonial matrix of power or patrón de poder, is that logic that makes that continuation possible. So that then, to finish the point 4 and go to the conclusion, one of the tasks, I think, or the issue that we have to think about ethics in and from the Americas is not just to think about the issues we have been discussing today, but I think we have to think seriously about that context in which we're operating, that is the kind of corporate ethics in the Americas, but also in the world. So that's kind of another way of linking ethics and politics. So conclusion, ethics and decoloniality and aesthetics and decoloniality. Well, you know, You know what one way I think about the links between, this is the way I explain this my graduate students, the connection between, to open up the discussion. So, well, you know, Aristotle in the Poetics, right? He didn't use aesthesis. He talked about mimesis, poiesis, and catharsis. And poiesis, catharsis, mimesis was related to the transformation of the kind of the affect of the audience. So when aesthesis, I mean feeling, sensibility, sensing. It's not that he didn't use aesthetic, he didn't use it in the poetics. He used it more in the ethics, aesthesis. So what is interesting here is that in the 18th century we have the kind of the first great transformation of the colonial matrix of power. And the first great transformation of colonial matrix of power is when the theological becomes secular. It's not the theological disappear, but the secular takes over, and it's all the kind of the work that Enrique is doing. So the secular is not, I mean, what is the secular? I mean, this is, Eduardo talked a lot about the secular, but one thing what I will talk here is that the secular is the articulation of a new way of being in the world, that is that ethno-class that we call today the bourgeoisie, right? And at that moment, there are tremendous transformation because, as you know, the invention of religion emerged. Aesthetic, as a theory in philosophy, emerged, but it's about the taste. It's about the taste, and Kant related to reason. So in observation on the beautiful and the sublime, Kant is fantastic, because in the fourth part, he disqualified the rest of the world as being able to sense the beautiful and the sublime, and all those people are those people who lack reason, and who has a lot of gods like Indians, and I mean Indians from India, etc., etc. So aesthesis disappears and is colonized by aesthetic. And it's at the same moment in which the ethos become ethics as a theory. But ethics and aesthetics deal with the secondary qualities, because reason is privilege, and reason at that moment began to be articulated in two fundamental institutions, the state and the market economy. So decolonizing ethics and decolonizing aesthetics, I think we have to, so decolonizing ethics to liberate the ethos, and to decolonize aesthetic to liberate aesthesis. Because with ethics and aesthesis, it happened exactly what happened here, that the kind of one line of thought, one set of languages, one set of country and institution control knowledge. So the task of ethics and decoloniality is related to, this is my last point, the way we all here discussing this, have to begin to imagine our task, our role at the university. What kind of research do we need? And what for? Because I sense that still we are operating in a kind of machine of a scholarship in which correcting previous interpretation, bringing new documents, bringing some kind of new novelty still guides our task. But the question is, for me, rethink and redo ourselves as a scholar and intellectuals, use the institution, but beyond the disciplines. So basically what I'm trying to say is that the disciplines at the university in higher education have put the cart in front of the horse. We have to get the horse in front of the cart and ask again, what kind of knowledge, why, and what for? And for me, the answer to that question, that doesn't have to be your answer, is decoloniality. For me, decoloniality is one of the necessary projects of the future. And I will say one more thing. Nelson talked about the decolonial turn. We talk about also the decolonial option. It's not that either or. There are different things. I mean, decolonial turn means, well, turn in English means two things, right? That you turn. So the decolonial turn is the turn of the decolonial, or the turn is that it's your turn. So it's the turn of the decolonial. Yeah, right? But the option, this is very important, because when you talk about the decolonial option and you said the decolonial is an option, it's not a mission, you are just putting something on the table, but you are not trying to missionize or convert. That is one of the advantage. The other advantage is that if you put the decolonial option as an option, you transform everything in option. So Christianity is an option, Marxism is an option, Islamism is an option, everything is an option. What you do, and this is the final radical movement, what you do, if you do that, you decolonize truth. And decolonized truth means that Marxism, Christianity, and Islamism, or neoliberalism, I forgot, are operating under the belief of truth without parentheses. And truth without parentheses goes to war, because whoever is not with me is against me. So the decolonial option predicates truth in parentheses. It's not that everything goes. No, I believe. I believe, and I take responsibility and fight for my truth. But at the same time, I recognize that there is another truth there. That was the problem of Mariátegui. If Mariátegui is recognized, and that is the problem of García Linera today in Bolivia, if they recognize that there is another truth there, well, you won't have the scandal of the Tibnis. But the problem of García Linera, and I don't know how to explain Morales here, but the problem of García Linera is the problem of Mariátegui. I mean, it's a kind of goodwill, but the limit of truth without parentheses. So with that, I stop.
Okay, so we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Walter, I think that in your talk now, you just confirm yourself as a descendant of Juan Poma de Ayala. Not only because you were talking about him, but I think that you exemplify in a couple of moves Juan Poma's sort of logic or intervention, which was very interesting. Like you were saying that when Juan Poma sort of he uses the logic of the Tahuantinsuyo to then bring down, relativize the claims of Spain by putting it as one of the suyos. And then you have a Spain, and you have blacks, and you have indigenous, and you have the Muslims. Well, in your 21st century of Juan Poma's move, then you have the Latinos, you have the Caribbean, you have indigenous, and then you have the whites. So in a way, doing to the whites something similar to what he was doing to the king of Spain, to the Spaniards, with the difference that I don't think that you want to put the equivalent of Philip III, which I guess will be the business part, right? You necessarily, that's the equivalent, right? That's the king now. And so, but you say, well, not so fast. We're not necessarily going to put you in the center. Come here to Cusco, although maybe that's what you're doing with asking us to think about the colonial business ethics or something like that. So I don't know. I have to figure that one out. But the other point in which you are becoming, you came out very much in that line, Wamampomian line of the colonial thinking, if we put it like that, was through the notion of the decolonial option. Because again, what Wamampomas does is that by putting the king as one of the suyos is relativizing the Spanish kingdom in a way, by your explanation of option is precisely doing that. Now everyone is an option. The Marxism is an option. Neoliberal is an option, and so on. So again, that's the second Wamampomian move in the talk. But I also wanted to say that the option and the decolonial option and turn, yes, I think that they are very much complementary. They are targeting different things. And what turn, in a way, is the way that is complementing to some extent is after you put the options, right? We put the options on the table, so with the result that everything is an option now, voila. But then the turn is saying whether you take the option or not, there is already, I mean, many of us will continue to do this. Many of us have already taken that option. So that's going to be a viable path, whether you take the option or not. And in fact, before us, a number of people have done, so much so that we can recognize indeed a turn out of coloniality to decoloniality, whether you want it or not. So I guess that would be the other one. Of course, when you put it on the table, you're not necessarily telling that there, or maybe you are, but it doesn't depend on them taking it, which I guess that's the Fanonian political move after the Etica. In the Etica, you relativize that. Then if there is resistance about the option, you know that, well, argumentation is over, then the political, right? Then there's a question of a political intervention and so on.
Two things, the first and the second. So the question of the Wamampomo today, that's very interesting because this is precisely what is going on in the Andes, not in the term that he proposed, but the whole discussion of the plurinational state is in that spirit. And that is a radical, for me, I mean, with a lot of very, very, very complex, because one thing is to have in the constitution of Bolivia and Ecuador, Bolivia is a plurinational state and Ecuador is a plurinational state. Doesn't mean that they are. It means that it's legal now to work toward a plurinational state. So that is what was in Nuche, in Wamampomo de Ayala. He saw that that there is a way, we have to find a way of conviviality with all these kind of different people, different memories in the Andes. So to make this kind of long story short, I think that the problem that Wamampomo faced and the solution he offered is now, in the 21st century, the problem of the modern colonial state. Because one thing is the modern colonial state, where you have, precisely because of colonization, you have a lot of nations, and you don't have the problem in France or Germany. Well, but you have, but I mean, it's not the same. It's not the same configuration in the sense that you have a state with people, European people and people who are not European. So in the state of Europe, I was thinking, it's when the national state is possible because it is possible at that moment to link the state to one nation. That's problematic, of course, but they did it, and then they have the Holocaust. So what is going now in Bolivia, but this is very advanced, and or in Ecuador, I don't think we go to the Holocaust, is very revolutionary because it's how to think of a state which is an administrative structure, but governed by several nations. And that, I think, you have to go a little bit into the 20 theses of politics that Enrique was articulating, the kind of deficitization of the state, etc. So, in that sense, Wamapoma is very actual, not that they want to apply like this, but the problematic persisted and the solution are being looked at in that direction. The second is, yeah, no, I agree. The only thing I want to say is that once you say that the decolonial option or the decolonial term, the challenge there is no longer to waste time and energy disqualifying the enemy. I think all the energy has to be put into creativity to make people realize that this is a wonderful option. Because if you have an option and that option is just play the negative, you will be miserable, and the other people will be miserable, and people who join the option will be resentful people because they will see and say, well, these people will help me to kind of kill the enemy. So that is, no, I think that the option and the turn are not, they are two different dimensions of the project, I will say.
Hi, Pedro Garcia Caro from Romance Languages here and Latin American Studies. I've been enjoying the discussions tremendously, and I think we, at this point, have pretty much covered the ethics of the multicultural dimensions of the Americas. And yet we are still at the gates and not quite defining how are we going to deal with industrial modernity. Industrial modernity, I think, is the clear challenge of the left still in Latin America. So one thing is for us to say, yes, we like Lula da Silva, yes, we like Evo Morales because they enfranchised the people who were previously disenfranchised through modernity and colonization. Yet another very different issue, which is unresolved, I'm afraid, by all the discussions that I've been listening to, is what Adorno and Horkheimer defined as the dark side of modernity that you also have worked on, that of industrial modernity, that of the exploitative nature of modernity. So what we now have, yes, is Evo managing lithium exports, but is that liberation?
No. I don't think so. Well, I mean, we have a lot of problems. One of them was dealt with by Adorno and Horkheimer. But the problem started before the Industrial Revolution. The problem started as Enrique was and Nelson were kind of insisting. The problem started with this kind of economy that liberals and Marxists call capitalism. A liberal like it, Marxists don't, but they agree that there is something called capitalism. We talk about the colonial matrix of power. So what you are talking about is one aspect of the colonial matrix of power, but the economy goes together with a set of domains that has to do with gender, sexuality, knowledge, politics, ethics, aesthetics, etc., etc. So it's not just the Industrial Revolution or the industrialization, but it's the whole cosmology and that support a rhetoric that maintain people believing and that is the only option in town, the only game in town. No, I don't think the Evo Morales. As a matter of fact, I was listening to Enrique yesterday, and I think I kind of disagree on that. I kind of disappointed. I never trust Garcia Linera. I knew him before. He's a brilliant guy, but at the same time, I always have the sensation, the feeling that there is something missing here. But I think it's worse than Mariátegui because he thought that he understood. And Mariátegui have doubts. So no, I think it's very deceptive because after having, I mean, Evo Morales organized a Cochabamba summit on the right of the Pachamama. And he managed to put in the United Nations a day of the Pachamama, or the Mother Earth. Pachamama, what do you mean Pachamama? Pacha is a very complex term. One of the meaning is space-time. And mama is most kind of energy. So it's the energy of space-time that give life, called Mother Earth, right? But the question is that after Evo did all that, he engaged in the mess of the Tibnis. Now, Enrique said, well, he just took a step back. But that step back is the same logic of the liberal and the neoliberal. He took a step back, made some kind of arrangement with the people of the Tibnis, but now they are trying to get the highway by a different means. So, to answer your question, I think that what we are facing is a way of being in the world, and that is why ethics is so important here. It's a way of being in the world that has to be constructed in order to give another option to what appears today as the only option, which is the kind of happiness by kind of possession. So that is the task, and I think we have to think, that's what I was finishing my talk. I mean, I think we have an important institution, the university, that is being taken by the corporation, but it's a very important institution to kind of work toward that transformation of a sense of being in the world. You know what kind of interesting now with addressing your problem? It's very sad to have so many unemployed in the United States, in Europe. But what is also sad is that with all that free time, the only thing that people unemployed expect is that the job come back. So the colonial matrix of power have kind of taken all the kind of the creativity of the people. And so the only thing that the people expect is that the corporation solve the problem. So this is what we have to kind of work on, kind of create option of empowerment. And creating option of empowerment means to build something. And the political society, what's important for me, the political society is not just a manifestation of resistance. As a colleague of us in Colombia talked about, there are manifestations of re-existence. So re-existence means to imagine new way of being in the world, just delinking from the rule of the game of the capitalist society. So this another thing I want, it has been going in my mind, but it's also kind of appropriate. You know, I was planning on talking a little bit more about Confucianism, and I want to say a few things now about. I mean, as we know, Confucianism is not a religion, right? It's a kind of set of norm of ethics, as we call it today. But what is interesting why I bring it here is because Confucianism now is back. After the West did with Confucianism exactly what they did with the Indians and other people, and Islam, etc. I mean, kind of from Kant on, kind of the value Confucianism. Now it's coming back. So people say, oh, well, the Chinese are kind of using Confucianism to affirm their nationalism. Yeah, so what? What is the problem? I mean, it's the United States and France, and they are not doing something very similar. I mean, kind of reaffirm their nationalism at the same time, they kind of articulate it. So, but what is interesting here is that why the government of China is rearticulating Confucianism. And I see two reasons. One is that if they don't articulate Confucianism to invent their own rhetoric of progress, they have to be neoliberal. And I say, well, Chinese are capitalists, but they are not neoliberal. We have to uncouple neoliberalism from capitalism. So Confucianism for the government means that we don't want to be neoliberals, but also we don't want to be Maoist. So Confucianism is a powerful tool of de-Westernization, although still we have a powerful industrial complex that pollutes the world and create internal conditions. On the other hand, the left, the new left in China, is rearticulating Confucianism. And why? Because if they don't go back to Confucianism, they have to go back to Adorno, to Marx, to Europe. So Confucianism become a very powerful tool of de-Westernization. But I say that because what is interesting here is that their cracks are being created within the capitalist world. And I think we have to be aware of this crack in order to advance other projects, like the decolonial project.
Well,